We are brought up to think that there's only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. So it's about noticing that there is another alternative. To notice that the people who are really pushing us back have been socialized to think there is no alternative, and to realize that we can bring about a shift from domination to partnership.
Hey everyone, it's Hildy, and this is the Creating the Future podcast. I'm glad you've joined us here today. This is a place for us to explore what really creates social change. What will move us beyond the assumption that change is slow and incremental to instead create the kind of dramatic, transformational change that we can see and feel? That is the question driving this podcast. What will actually create the healthy, joyful future we all want to live in? I could not be more excited about today's guest, Riane Eisler. Riane's work spans decades of world events, starting as her family escaped the Nazis in her native Austria. She is a sociologist, a futurist, a feminist. Riane's groundbreaking work has led to her addressing the UN General Assembly, and she's been awarded the Distinguished Peace Leadership Award by the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, the same honor that has been awarded to folks like the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, and Jane Goodall. When I talk with Riane, her focus on the dynamics of partnership versus domination becomes so clear. And so it is my honor and my pleasure to welcome Riane Eisler to the podcast today. Welcome, Riane. It is just such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I have to say, I've been looking forward to this conversation. I'm so glad you're here.
Well, I am so glad to be with you. We had a time making this work with all the technology, but it did.
We did it. We did it. The technology is always the problem. I would love for you to tell our listeners just a little bit about what is it that led you into a life of social change, because you really have dedicated your entire life to social change. What is it in your being that led you to that?
Well, I have a lot of passion, as you know, from my work and for my work. And that passion is very deeply rooted in my childhood experiences as a refugee child with my parents out from the Nazis. And from really one day to the next, from being this cute little kid that people patted on the head, my parents and I, we became hunted with license to kill. And we escaped by a miracle that was really due to my mother. She recognized on Crystal Night one of the men who came to our home as a former errand boy for the family business, and she got furious. He was an Austrian Nazi, and she said, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you? I want him." And as I said, she could have been killed, because many Jewish people were killed on Kristallnacht, which was the first official Nazi pogrom against Jews in both Germany and Austria, but she wasn't, and by another miracle, and some money did pass hands, she got my father out from Gestapo headquarters, and she even got a conduit, a free conduit, so that when they came back, and they did come back, she could show it. And eventually, my parents were able to purchase a visa to Cuba, but we had to leave everything really behind, except for what my parents could smuggle out. And I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana, where I saw another injustice, the terrible disparities at that time in Cuba between haves and have-nots. And all of this led me to questions that eventually my work sought to answer years later through my transdisciplinary, cross-cultural, transhistorical research. And the questions were, does it have to be this way? When we humans, as I saw with my mother, have such a capacity for love, for caring, why has there been so much violence, so much cruelty, so much insensitivity? Is it, as we're told by stories like Original Sin or Selfish Genes, that there's something wrong with us, with, quote, human nature? Or is there an alternative? And as I said, years later, I set out to answer this question. And what I found is that, yes, there is an alternative, but we can't see it through the lenses of conventional social categories like right-left, religious-secular, Eastern-Western, Northern-Southern, capitalist-socialist, and so on. Because, for one thing, there have been repressive, violent regimes in every one of these categories. So none of them tells us what we have to build, really, as an alternative. For another, they really fragment our consciousness, focusing on different things, like economics in one, like socialist, location, like east-west, north-south, etc., etc. But most important, and this came really like a thunderbolt, they all either marginalize or ignore nothing less than the majority of humanity, women and children, and therefore family, because in what I call rigid domination systems, women and children are confined to the family. And I began to see patterns, configurations that repeated themselves cross-culturally, transhistorically, and there were no names, so I called one the domination system and the other one the partnership system. And because really it's always a matter of degree, I also introduced the partnership domination social scale.
I must confess, I have been a fan of your writings for many, many years, and I'm loving hearing your story. It adds even more depth to everything that I've appreciated over time. I'm curious, in all that you have experienced, all that you have studied, all that you have seen, when you do see change happening, and we do see change happen. It's easy to get stuck in that paradigm where we say nothing ever changes, but we do see change happening. And our listeners really want to get past the little incremental change and see what can actually create sweeping change. What have you seen that really supports change? What is it that creates social change? What is undergirding change when it happens?
I think that if you look at the entire social picture, what you see is that, well, first of all, you see that the struggle for our future is not between right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist. It's really between the configurations of the partnership and domination systems. And you also see that there are today many trends towards partnership. The domination system is really an in-group versus out-group system. Wow. Starting with the in-group of both mankind and the female other, we have a model that children internalize very early in their families, usually, were different. Starting with the difference between the female and male form, is equated with either superiority or inferiority, with either dominating or being dominated, with either being served or serving. And that then is applied to other differences, race, religion, We get racism, we get anti-Semitism, we get all the ugly isms, really. So in my most recent book, Nurturing Our Humanity, I really draw very heavily from neuroscience, which shows that we have to pay attention to how our brains develop. The structure of our brain is really very, very much impacted by the culture that is transmitted, first in families, then in education, in economics, in politics, that we've inherited from more rigid domination times, whether it orients to partnership or to domination. And so if you ask me, we are in a period of regression worldwide towards the domination system, which actually should not surprise us, because there has been so much movement, anti-racism, equality for women and men, very fundamental things, not just symptoms, but basics. And what we're seeing is this regression, and we really have to pay attention to 4 cornerstones of either domination or partnership systems. And they're not what you would think. Starts with family and childhood. That's the first cornerstone. The second cornerstone is gender, which we've been taught to just think of as a, quote, women's issue, marginal. The third is economics. And the fourth is story and language. And our job now is to shift these cornerstones, these foundations, from domination to partnership. You asked, what do I see happening? I see a lot of tactics, but we have to have some tactics. After all, we have to put out the fires, if you will, created constantly, chronically created by the domination system, which is inherently violent. Wife beating, child beating, lynchings, aggressive wars. That's built into the in-group versus out-group character of that system. But we also have to work not just on symptoms, but on root causes. And that's really the 4 cornerstones.
Absolutely. So much of the work at Creating the Future is rooted in neuroscience. The acknowledgement that we're biological creatures. We tend to think we're separate from the rest of the world, which is just absolutely ridiculous. But we're biological creatures just like any other biological creature. And the first thing that drives us is the way our brains work. And to ignore that is counterproductive. But to embrace it is to really go with what we can make possible. I loved that you mentioned the phrase human nature. I always laugh at the fact that when we talk about human nature, we're never talking about what's good about us. When we say, oh, that's just human nature, we're never saying it in a good way. We're saying it in a bad way. And what we've come to realize is that all of those expressions about what we say is just human nature is all of the stuff that we actually share with the rest of the animal world. My dog gets angry. You go down the list of all the things that they're greedy. They're humans are just these horrible, violent. Well, so are all the other animals. The thing that makes us human is the stuff they can't do. So I'm really loving the fact that you're embracing the neuroscience of this so much, because really at the core, that's what we are.
Really, the argument between nature and nurture is a way of fragmenting our consciousness, because neuroscience shows again and again that it's nature and nurture. And that the nurture, which takes us back to culture, of course, has a huge, huge role to play. And in that, we really have to look at how the socialization of people in domination systems has a lot to do with gender stereotypes. This is not a question of women against men or men against women. Men have actually a terrible time in domination systems. For one thing, they have to give nothing but their lives, their very lives, because some guy on top, like a Putin today, wants more real estate. But they also have to suppress, because the definition of masculinity in domination systems is very simple. It is equated with violence. It is equated with domination. It is really a very negative definition. And it isn't that men don't get emotions, because they get contempt, they get anger. But the, quote, soft, quote, feminine emotions, those are off bounds. And so it's not only women that have to change the socialization. There is activity against, quote, domestic violence. But again, domestic violence is marginalized. I'm very much want to see a campaign that is against family violence, violence in the family, against both women and children of both genders. I remember being in a park one day and hearing a man's voice shouting, "Take that." And then a child, a boy, wailing, really crying. And this male voice said, "I will hit you as long as you cry. Men don't cry." This is perhaps an extreme, and that has to change in childhood, starting in family.
I was rereading some of your work this morning, and I was struck by a campaign that you were part of years ago to eliminate from, and some of our listeners may not remember a time when the want ads were in the newspaper. We didn't just go to Craigslist and get what we needed, but we actually had to pay to put ads in the newspaper. And I was so struck by the elimination. And I was thinking back, oh my gosh, I remember this, when the want ads read, "Help wanted male" and "Help wanted female." And I'm curious, talk a little bit about that campaign and how you helped to change that. We totally forget that we had completely segregated the kinds of work that went under male, the kinds of work that went under female. And of course, the male work was all the work that actually got you someplace in your career. And the female work was always the stuff that was underpaid and underappreciated.
It was a motto, and it's still a motto. It's don't agonize, organize.
Don't agonize, organize.
And that's how, basically, in a nutshell, we did it. But it was a time of awakening, and that's what we did. I suddenly woke up. And so, again, I want to emphasize this just because we have to really pay attention to it if we want to really change the system. Does not mean that men, for that human nature, is bad. It means that we've internalized this as the only possibility. And it's a lie. And we know that it's a lie if we just simply look around us at the configuration of the most repressive, violent states in all these categories. I mean, it can be the Taliban. Gender is a huge thing there. Can be from the Middle East, Iran. It can be the MAGA movement here in the United States. It can be Hitler's Nazi Germany. It can be Stalin's former Soviet Union. It can be the Maasai of Africa. They all orient very closely to the domination side. But there are contemporary societies that actually do orient to the partnership side. My first book that really made a splash and is still going strong, The Chalice and the Blade, what it shows is that for millennia, human culture in our prehistory oriented more to the partnership side. And this is very important to see that contemporary societies can move towards partnership. As we have, we wouldn't be here right now having this conversation with Wilt. Just 300 years ago, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch burnings, would be considered heretics.
I'm curious what you're seeing nowadays in terms of the evolution of more partnership relationship.
Well, if we look at Nordic nations, for example, we see they're always in the top ranks of the World Happiness Report. So partnership is good for human beings. They have very successful market economies, which means they're not socialists. But what distinguishes them is the configuration of the partnership system. And I want to tell you about that. First of all, in both the family and in the state or tribe, the normative ideal is a more egalitarian one, a more equitable. The second normative ideal in these nations is partnership between women and men and the elevation of the, quote, feminine, caring, caregiving, nonviolence. So what do we see in these nations? We see, first of all, very generous paid parental leave. We see caring policies, universal health care, child care that is well paid, and that is very accessible. And yes, it is subsidized by the taxes of everyone. But also we see something very interesting. We see that these nations such as Norway, Finland, Sweden, pioneered the first laws stating that it is against the law to use physical discipline against children. And they started the first peace academies. You know, we have all of these war academies,
right?
The first peace academies. So you see that what distinguishes them is the partnership rather than the domination configuration. You know, when Chalice was first published, I got a phone call from an anthropologist from the University of California, and he said, I did my field work among the Terai in the Philippines, and I used to call them radically egalitarian. But now I see they have the configuration of the partnership system. And yes, gender equity, not sameness. This is the valuing of different. That's the key. And of course, you see on the other side, whether it's the Taliban or whether it's Khomeini's Iran or Nazi Germany, or Stalin's from the Soviet Union, or the MAGA movement in the United States, tremendous emphasis on family and childhood control, and control through the threat or the actual violence, as in the so-called Christian parenting guides, which tell parents not to, quote, spoil their children, which bring to the fore again this terrible teaching of spare the rod, spoil the child. That's a domination mantra, for goodness sakes, but also gender. The man has to be the head of household, and the woman and the child are to obey him. That used to be part of the wedding vows.
Absolutely.
The woman had to obey. We have to connect the dots. The present paradigm is fragmenting. It's completely fragmenting our consciousness.
I'm recalling the blooming of the feminist movement in the 60s. And that so much of that came from the fact that there was so much social change, social protest happening during that time. And yet the women were relegated to go get coffee, honey, and the men were making the big decisions. It's so easy to look at our current circumstances, see what isn't working, but so much has shifted. And I'm curious, in your experience, we have seen shifts in racial relations, we have seen shifts in gender relations. I'm curious, in your experience, what do you see that is actually causing that?
Well, what causes it is changes in consciousness and disequilibrium, social disequilibrium, technological change. The Industrial Revolution, which happened over about 300 or so years, but culminated really in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That brought about one social movement after another, all challenging the same thing, a tradition of domination. Think about it. First came the Enlightenment movement, then the feminists challenging the tradition of rule of men over the children and women in the castles of their homes. And then came the abolitionist movement, the really anti-racism movements of all kinds, all the way through to the Black Lives Matter movement, challenging another tradition of domination. Again, the right of a, quote, superior race to rule over, quote, inferior ones. All the way to the environmental movement, which really started in the 20th century, challenging man's once hallowed conquest and domination of nature. And these movements again accelerated. And so we have to reward what really matters, and we have to measure what really matters, which is caring for people starting at birth and caring for our Mother Earth. And yes, they are very much related.
You're making me think about the power of language, that seeing things through a lens of dominator versus partnership. You bring that into any conversation, and it would be very interesting to see where people land on, oh, maybe this conversation is getting into a dominator stance. What would it take for us to be more partnership? I mean, there's something in those two words that I think are very powerful and almost very igniting in some cases. It's almost subversive language, Riane.
Well, we have to change our language. Even small adages like killing two birds with one stone. Well, why not hatching two birds with one egg? It communicates the same thing, using our creativity in just about everything around us, not just the physical world, but our cultures, our norms. They're human creations. So we can recreate them, but we have to pay attention, as you quite mentioned, starting with story and language. Changing the language from domestic violence to family violence, for example. Violence in the family, that's something else, isn't it?
I'm struck by, you've mentioned several times in our conversation here, the word consciousness. And consciousness really is about what are we noticing? And what you are bringing up here is so many different ways of looking at things, that things change when we see them differently. And that's so much at the heart of what you're talking about.
Well, we are brought up to think that there's only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. And Mr. Trump, for example, has said it's all about domination. So it's about noticing that there is another alternative, that it existed for thousands of years in our prehistory, and it is a struggle for our future because our children, I worry so much about my children and my grandchildren. It can't go on like this, and it won't go on like this. And the answer is not disruption. It is showing that there is another alternative and laying the foundations for it by focusing on these four cornerstones of childhood and family, of gender, of economics, and of story and language, all of which are interconnected. It's all about connecting the dots.
If you had one piece of advice to share with our listeners in terms of how to become more aware, how to refocus, and how to move forward, how to create change, what would that piece of advice be?
Well, I think that it would be to notice, as you said, the things that we've been talking about here. To notice that the people who are really pushing us back have been socialized to think there is no alternative and really believe this. And to realize that there is an alternative and that by focusing on these four foundations, we can bring about a shift in them from domination to partnership.
Riane, thank you so much for spending time with us today. This has been an absolute delight, a real pleasure, and I wish you so well in continuing to raise our awareness about these issues. Thank you so much.
Well, you are a very important part of raising the awareness, and so are our listeners. Every one of us can change our own consciousness and help change the consciousness of others. Every one of us can help create the foundations for a partnership world. Not ideal, but much, much more sustainable and much, much more pleasurable. A world where we can not only survive, but thrive.
Could not ever hear it better. Thank you. I'm so grateful to Riane for sharing her observations and experience with us. And what a lifetime of experience that has been. The examples Riane shared help us to see so clearly that the struggle for our future is between systems of domination versus systems of partnership. Seeing through that lens, so much becomes obvious in all aspects of our lives, what Riane talks about as the four cornerstones of family, gender, economics, and language. How much of our language is filled with words of domination? The war on poverty, the war on terror. We fight for social justice. We seek an army of supporters. I confess in my own writing and speaking, I find that those words of domination come so quickly to mind. They leave me searching for words that aren't so domineering. Riane shows us a different way, though, a path that isn't just about the world outside, but about our own work as change makers. How much of that work is about dominating versus partnering? Do we see ourselves as leading our communities or working with our communities? And for those of you who are grant makers and donors, are you working with the recipients of your funding, or are you stuck in that power dynamic that stems from the dominator role? Bottom line, the more we are mindful of that dynamic of domination versus partnership, the more effective our social justice efforts will be. You can learn more about Riane's work at the podcast page for this episode. And of course, if this episode got you thinking, we hope you'll share this podcast with your friends and colleagues and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, you can learn more about Creating the Future's work at creatingthefuture.org. Thank you for being with us today and for wanting to create a better future for our world. We'll see you next time here at Creating the Future.